those 20% of things that are going to lead to the vast majority of progress, or the vast majority of that foundational level of program design.
And my entire job as a coach is to find those emerging strategies. I'm looking for that. So if I end up seeing it and observing it, then I know I got a key in my hand, a tool in the toolbox that I can use whenever and bring back whenever.
What's going on, guys? I am Kristen Dunsmore, and I'm here with Zac Robinson and Josh Pelland from Data Driven Strength. And we have some guy, I guess he's kind of strong, Joe Borenstein. I hear you're pretty strong.
Thank you. I appreciate y'all having me on.
Yeah. How's it going this morning?
All good. Just did some cardio, just some quick responses for the athletes. Now I'm here sitting down with you guys.
Yeah, well, good to hear. So tell me a little bit about your past meet that you did.
So Worlds was my previous meet, and before that it was Nationals. Quick turnaround between the two, but I was pacing pretty highly right after Nats. I did 900, and then I was planning to beat that a little bit more, or just like by a couple kilos, because my rate of progress was actually like speeding up. Like right after Nats, I hit PR doubles, and then the final block out, I got like a horrible sickness, and I lost like 2 kilos of body weight. I still showed up on meet day totaling 890, and I still won, so I was grateful for that. But not the performance I wanted, considering the prep I just had and the performance I had at Nationals. But still, a world champion is, or a world title is the number one thing you can shoot for in this sport, I believe. So even though the total wasn't the best or wasn't the highest I've ever done, I think it was more valuable than what I did at Nationals. So I'm definitely grateful for the experiences.
Yeah. Well, what's your next meet coming up?
It will be the Houston meet from Avansis. That will be October 11th. So I think it's like 5 weeks exactly to the day of this recording. So a couple more training blocks, or not even, just one more block. I got week 4 of this week coming up, and then it's go time. So
yeah. So tell me a little bit about your current training.
Yeah, so I started the off season. Well, to preface this, I was very detrained coming off from Worlds because I had my honeymoon directly after. So I took 12 or maybe 13 days off completely from lifting any types of weights, and I wasn't eating. I was probably getting like 7 hours, 6 hours of sleep, which I come from like 9 to 10. So recovery was horrible. I was detrained. I lost a bunch of weight. I was like 82 kilo versus my normal like 84 and a half, 85. And I just came into the first block with zero expectation. Bench took a huge hit because that's the lift I did the most frequency with, and it's affected a lot by body weight. So that lift took quite a while to rebound, and I'm actually just now getting back to the swing of things with my bench press, and it's been 3 full blocks. So, but deadlift and squat, however, I PR'd the first block back. So first block of off season, even though I was detrained coming into it, those 2 lifts just boomed, and I hit all-time PRs for reps. And then the block after, hit another PR on squat. Failed the deadlift, so be it. But this block coming in, I'm being more conservative with the pacing, especially on my secondary days. So I should be a lot more recovered going into my week 4. So I believe I'd be able to squeeze out a couple other PRs on all 3 lifts, actually. So this is the strongest I felt since coming back from Worlds. Actually, probably the strongest I felt since Nationals. So definitely excited for the near future and see what I can put up at the Houston meet.
Yeah, I'm excited to see your performance then. So I wanted to just talk about your current training. Josh and Zac can kind of lead into this. Just kind of your current progression methods and some of the training principles that you're currently doing.
Yeah. So Joe, the number one thing people can probably take away from some of the things you've already mentioned so far, whether that be, competing at high level meets, or obviously having, training methods that you're very well refined, obviously, to allow you to get to those level of performance, but also some coaching experience that you have as well to kind of see how those methods play out in other people as well and how those generalize. I think one of the things we're excited about as a team at Evolve is trying to improve upon the tools that coaches and lifters have access to kind of meet lifters across the spectrum from where they're at. And so one of the main things and kind of main design philosophies that we've had is, if we can essentially meet the needs of very high level lifters like yourself and high level coaches, there's kind of a trickle down effect that will make it so that we can automate some of the those decisions that go into those extremely high level programs to deliver effective programming essentially across the lifter spectrum, whether that be somebody who's just starting powerlifting, getting into their first meet, just starting training, or people like yourself all the way up to the highest levels of competition. So from our perspective of things, one of the things we're always interested to do is talk to high level lifters and coaches like yourself, hear about the way that you approach your own training, approach the training of your athletes, and talk about the infrastructure that we hopefully have built from the software side of things to hopefully support that style of training and help you execute things as well as possible. So I guess from my perspective, some of the questions I'm interested in kind of asking you. First and foremost, kind of I have two kind of main buckets of things that I like to separate kind of training down into. And listening to some other conversations you've been a part of, I think you do a really, really good job at nailing this first bucket of things. So have you ever heard of like the 80-20 principle? That's kind of the way that I think of about a lot of things. So what that means is, typically speaking, there's 80% of things that are going to deliver 20% of the results. Those are kind of like your really fine, minute adjustments, versus the opposite, which is the 20% of basic things that are going to provide the vast majority of results. So when I think about training, I kind of separate things into those major buckets. And again, from a software side of things, we're trying to attack both of those. And so I guess when you're kind of thinking about your own training, the training of your athletes, what would you say are kind of the things that come to mind as the biggest rocks, the things that are going to be the vast majority, are they going to be the factors that are going to lead to the vast majority of your progress? And ultimately, how do you view that kind of that sector of the programming training world?
Definitely pacing. I'd say pacing is number one on all the days, like whether it's tertiary bench, primary squat, throughout the entirety of the block, and then as well as accessories. And we can throw pacing in that as well, but more so just doing accessories and hitting an adequate amount of volume to drive, hypertrophy, because, a bigger muscle always has higher potentiality to become a stronger muscle. And as natural powerlifters, we have to have enough accessory volume year round to stimulate muscle growth. So, if muscle is the main bottleneck within natural powerlifting, I believe we have to prioritize accessories, but also the pacing of those accessories, and then the pacing of the SBD movements to ensure that we're not overshooting the week ones, because we have to strip the fatigue coming off the high intensity week 4 if we did push the intensity the block prior. So we have to conservatively approach those week ones, slowly ramp up adequately from week 2 to 3 to 4. But everyone's pacing going to be different. Some people need smaller percent jumps. Some people need more stagnant RPEs. Some people need the bigger RP jumps, where, like myself, for example, I don't want to jump too far ahead because I know we're going to deep dive into it. But I jump, let's say on deadlift, like I jumped 30 kilos this last week on deadlift, right, for a double. The average person is not doing that. They're jumping, 10, 12, 15 kilos. If you're pulling in the 300s, maybe 20. But I know my body responds better to those jumps because I cannot take condensed jumps throughout 4 full weeks, maybe 5 weeks of a block. So I need those higher percents. Whereas, let's say a female lifter, 59 kilo, they may not need, a 30 kilo jump. Even the percent of that, they probably need a far smaller of a margin compared to I. So, yeah, I think, like I said, pacing, all the SPD movements, and then accessory pacing and just accessory volume as well would be the two, I guess, main variables that I like to attack when looking at a program or making a new program.
Gotcha. Yeah, just to jump in here really quick. I'm excited about this discussion because you were kind enough to share the specifics of your training ahead of time. And we'll get to that later on in terms of like how, as Zac said, from the software side of things, from the tool side of things, we at Evolve are working on making those things more readily available to the entire spectrum of lifters. So I'm excited about that because I can tell from our previous discussions as we're seeing your training. And I would also just say from, I guess, the general powerlifting programming sphere right now, there's a lot of alignment in terms of how we think about training. And I'm biased, but I think it's a very principle-based and appropriate way to think about training. And there's exciting things coming amongst Evolve and Joe that, we'll talk more about later on. But for now, I think there's a lot of excitement amongst us for kind of that alignment regarding training. The way that I think about it, and I'm curious if you all agree, is like there's kind of a 2-step process in terms of program design. The first is going to be setting up a training split. And then the second is going to be creating progressions from that training split within those protocols. Obviously, there's a lot more that goes into that in terms of periodization, etc. But I can tell that's how you think about training. Of course, you can let me know if you disagree, but that seems to be how you generally think about training from a very high level. And there were a few terms that you kind of use there that I think imply that that's how you think about training. And it might be helpful for the listener if we kind of define those and make those a little bit more explicit. So, for example, you think about training in terms of weeks. So you mentioned week 1s, week 2, week 3, week 4, and you specifically highlighted week 4 and week 1. So I assume your baseline is kind of a 4-week block. So week 1s have a certain goal, weeks 4 have a certain goal, and therefore week 2 and week 3 also have a certain goal. So maybe let's start there. And I'm curious what you think about that general block structure and how you've come to conceptualize it, even if it feels pretty basic to you at this point, because it's just how you automatically think about training. I think it'd be helpful for the listener just to kind of make those things explicit.
Yeah. So majority, I'd say, of powerlifting coaches and philosophy now has some sort of periodization where we have some mesocycle, so entire block. So we have microcycles, which is like the week. The meso would be like the 4 to 5 weeks, and the macro would be the accumulation of 4 to 5 week blocks throughout a span, right? And every part of those steps has a goal, right? So the microcycle would be like, okay, what days of the week do I need to hit certain lifts? Like the golden microcycle, I need this amount of benches, this amount of squats, this amount of deadlifts, this exposure, these intensities, volume, whatever, in 1 week. The mesocycle would be the accumulation of those individual weeks. And we have to have some sort of progression from 1 week, the first week in my case, to the last week, which is the 4th week. Sometimes 5 weeks if that's line up to a meet day or if I have a deload thrown in there. But we have to have some sort of progress to stimulate, progression, right? We can't just do the same exposure, same load, same volume intensities. The body needs to adapt from something, right? So we have to increase one of these variables. So week 1, I like to start off at a lower intensity. So the RPE, the relative intensity, right? Because we have relative and absolute. Absolute is the load on the bar. Relative would be the exertion given throughout the exercise. So I like to increase, obviously, both as the weeks go on. But as the load is increasing, the relative, so the RPE itself, isn't increasing as much because week 1s are generally the weakest of the week. You're the most fatigued. So let's say I jump 30 kilos from a week 1 to 2. That week 1 is gonna probably feel similarly as heavy as week 2, just because of the fatigue I was carrying, right? So you have to pace accordingly throughout this entire mesocycle, the week 1 to the week 4 in my case. Some people have 6, 7, 8 week blocks. Those are a lot more stretched out. They're a lot longer. So the periodization is going to be a lot more stagnant. Whereas my program, for example, I'm more linear and I'm increasing at a faster rate, taking those bigger jumps, like I said, taking those bigger RPE gaps as well. I'm jumping a full RPE, maybe an RPE and a half, 2 RPE. The program might say 1 RPE, but in reality, it's probably like 2 or 3. Because I like taking those week 1s a lot more sub max. But yeah, it's all about pacing yourself and making sure you show up to that final week, or the week that you want to show up the strongest. You want to make sure that you are the strongest. So making sure every week prior to it is set up so you're exposing that top end the way you want to on that last week. You're able to execute those goals that you want to, whether it's a volume goal, intensity goal, an RPE goal, even maybe moving a single at a lower RPE. So yeah, it's all about setting. It's about finding the structure of the week, and then pacing those weeks and weeks and weeks to hit the goal you want. And then once you look at a bigger picture, let's say 12, 16, 20 weeks, that's when you start looking at, the whole macro and understanding like, okay, this week 4 built into that week 4, that week 4 built into that week 4, accumulating all the way into the end of the macro or into the meet day, whenever that ends. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question. I don't want to go too far off the rails.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really good. And oftentimes when I try to think about these conversations, I like to kind of take what I call the methods, or those are the applied tools or applied strategies that we come to in a given scenario, and then kind of take a step back and view kind of more possible strategies or more possible scenarios and kind of extract the principles from there. And it seems like to me the major thing that's kind of in a shift in kind of the modern powerlifting landscape, at least kind of the way that I view it, is kind of reconceptualizing the principle of overload a little bit. So obviously progressive overload, that's kind of when I was leading you into that question initially, that's the one that pops into mind for me. I'm probably didn't articulate the question very well, but that's the one that comes to me in mind of like those 20% of things that are going to lead to the vast majority of progress, or the vast majority of kind of that foundational level of program design is going to just be the principle of overload. So from a software perspective, we're trying to support that in as many ways as possible, because that is such a foundational and such an important thing for program design in general. We want to try to do various things to help make that process easier, whether that's helping you track your loads for each one of your exercises, the reps you performed, the obviously allowing for prescriptions, which I'll touch on here in a second, that have a kind of a moving target for a progression scheme, just in a variety of different ways. But the thing that's interesting to me from like a kind of a modern powerlifting landscape is that I think the principle overload is somewhat changed from the way that I used to view it, or at least conceptualize it more so as kind of if I have a set measuring stick or a set protocol, let's say. So, think about your basic kind of novice linear progression, 3 sets of 5, like RP 7 or 8, let's say, just as a basic example. And every single week you're approaching that exact same measuring stick and hoping to improve your performance. And so because the measuring stick is the exact same, if I'm able to complete that same prescription with a heavier load, I've achieved overload. I'm essentially demonstrating that I progressed. The interesting thing about kind of modern powerlifting in the way that things are set up is most of the times we have these progression schemes that are usually pretty specific and designed to handle certain scenarios like you've just laid out. And that measuring stick is slightly shifting, but the absolute load is increasing week to week. And that seems to be something that a lot of coaches have picked up on as kind of like this independent stimulus, for lack of a better term, in terms of saying, like you were just mentioning, really specifically understanding the kilo jumps that you're taking each week, trying to hit a heavier load or trying to hit this peak load on the week 4 of the block. So I just think those things are super, super interesting. And so that's from the software perspective. Again, we've tried to take this feedback from high level athletes and coaches like yourself and really, really build out what I think is a pretty cool interface and a pretty cool way of going about handling these types of things to make sure that the tools that you're reaching for these high levels of performance or to solve specific problems with your athletes, we're able to support in a pretty collaborative way. So I think that's pretty interesting. But Josh, I don't know if that would be a good time to start showing some things to kind of give some visuals to this.
Yeah, I think some visuals will be helpful, but maybe even before then, to kind of contextualize the visuals, and this could be for you, Joe, or anyone else. So we kind of established, okay, we have like this general like structure at various levels. Of course, you have like an exercise itself, you have a session itself, but probably the best starting point that a lot of people think about is the microcycle or the training split or the training week. That gives rise, using progressions or pacing that you mentioned, to the mesocycle, and then multiple mesocycles gives rise to a macrocycle. And oftentimes that the timing of that macrocycle is dependent on a competition timeline or maybe some sort of needs analysis, if you will, for a given athlete based on like the flavor of training they should spend a little bit more or less time in, or injuries, etc. So, okay, we have this general structure, and that structure, I think, it's not a method, right? And I think that's important to mention on the front end, is that even if you don't explicitly use that structure, I think it's there almost all the time, right? If you think of RPE, it's the same idea. It's like, even if you don't train with RPE, it's still there. You still have a proximity to failure at the end of a set. Same idea if you just use RPE. The percentages are still there, right? Those things are basically interchangeable. So the same idea here is like, when we use these terms, if you download Evolve and you give it a whirl for a free trial, those things are kind of like necessary knowledge to have to really leverage the app. Whereas if you download more of a general training app that's very like general fitness focused, it's probably very, very simple in terms of, hey, here's a workout, here's the next workout. And the way that those workouts are programmed, of course, will vary, and there's better and worse iterations of that. That's awesome. That makes sense for that population. But for serious strength trainees, that structure really matters. And that's something that Joe, you as a coach, and I think just everyone on this call and experienced powerlifters in general have picked up on that, hey, maybe you don't put as much stock into a week 1 performance or a week 1 estimated 1RM or a week 1, load and rep combination as you do a week 4 or a week 5, because the conditions are different, right? So all of that is to say is, okay, we generally have this structure. This structure is there basically whether you think it's there or not. Now, I think the next logical question is like, what are the biggest levers to pull within that structure for individualization? And Joe, I'm curious what comes to mind for you, and maybe you have like an athlete example or an example for yourself regarding levers that you've pulled in terms of individualizing within that structure. I know you've mentioned pacing a few times. That's obviously one. But I'm curious if anything else comes to mind in terms of like, just to really simplify the question is like, what are the main individualization levers for yourself or for athletes that you're looking at that you think are going to provide the biggest return on investment? Because obviously athlete A versus athlete B, their programming is going to be different.
Yeah, so it would have to probably, I'll incorporate the fatigue they're feeling on a certain week before pulling those levers. So for me, for example, unless I'm going into the week 4, I feel a little more beat up, right? I may regulate my secondary day a little bit, jump 5 kilos instead of the initial 10 or 15 that was planned to accommodate for that fatigue. Or on the accessory pacing side, I will, not back end deload, but I'll front end the accessories. So I basically have my lightest week of accessories on that final week of the block where I have my, heaviest SPDs. So that allows me to get a little more recoverability to be used towards SPD movements, but I still get my entire 4 weeks of progressing accessories. It's just the last week of the block is my week 1. And then the first week of the block is my week 2 of accessory. And then obviously the week 3 of the block is my last week of accessories or my heaviest week of accessories. So these little adjustments it's very lifter dependent. Like if you're an absolute beginner or like a borderline intermediate, you may just can get away with pushing accessories throughout the entire 4 weeks. But once you start, seeing that fatigue accumulate come week 4 and you notice you're just burning out and you've tried, pulling back SPD movements, it's still not working, then maybe do the opposite. Keep SPD movements somewhat more intense and then just pull back accessories to boost that recoverability. So these little, like you said, levers that can be pulled are very lifter dependent. It changes from, female to male, their leverage, training experience, their absolute strength at the time. So it all depends, but usually I look at the fatigue, their performance, and that's when I decide which lever to end up pulling.
Nice. And then I'm just curious. So it sounds like week 4 or week 5, whatever that final week of the mesocycle or the block is, on the primary days, those are the performances you're really looking at.
Exactly.
And again, I'm just curious about this for like own personal interest reasons. Let's say that those are progressing nicely, right? Those week 4 performances are progressing nicely for someone. And you have like a training split set up for them that, you kind of created on the front end or that you've landed on over a few iterations. If things are going well in terms of progress, do you change that setup very often? Or would you only change the training week if there's a problem? So I guess another way to think about that is like, to what degree do you periodize like SPD frequency?
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So if I ever observe a strategy that's emerging, I'm always going to keep it there. I'm never going to steer away from some bread and butter, right? The bread and butter of the program that I know that works. And my entire job as a coach is to find those emerging strategies. I'm looking for that. So if I end up seeing it and observing it, then I know I got a key in my hand, a tool in the toolbox that I can use whenever and bring back whenever. But I usually don't adjust or change too much when I see something working like that. There's always going to be some sort of progression from that block to block, but it's going to be a much smaller change in comparison to if the lift was going subpar or below our standard, right? So yeah, that's the main goal as a coach, to see what strategy emerges, keep that strategy, and then continue to push into that envelope, and just get as much progression you can out of it as possible. And then once you see that progression stall a bit, that's when you reintroduce another lever or pull another lever. But once you see it working, yeah, do not change things that work. It's there for a reason. Your body likes it for a reason. So
Yeah, that's kind of the answer I was expecting. And I think like Zach, Kristen, and I are all in alignment with that. And I think a lot of powerlifting coaches, they're just like, hey, if good things are happening, like you're gonna have to really twist my arm to change it up, right? Because progress is a beautiful thing. The grass can sometimes seem greener on the other side, but that can definitely lead you down the wrong path. So someone else can feel free to fill the air for a little bit while I get things set up on my end to provide some visuals here.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say other than like, yeah, I'm interested to kind of show some of these things that you're talking about, Joe, and just kind of how those things can play out and ultimately be adjusted. But one of the just totally random interesting things to me nowadays is like what periodization or periodized training means in kind of the context of today's world versus 10, 20 years ago is just very, very, very different. And it's really interesting. Like I think looking at a lot of programs out there today, I think like maybe even sometimes just like a couple sets are what is like changing or progressing week to week, whereas the vast majority of the program is pretty static, which and it's kind of fitting under this quote unquote periodized umbrella, whereas it used to be the case where everything was changing drastically block to block, which I think is kind of hitting on what you're saying, Joe, is once you're finding an effective strategy or kind of an effective overall formula that you're operating off of, you're making these small manipulations to kind of keep the momentum or the absolute performance kind of moving week to week for a variety of reasons, whether that's like the perceived stimulus or even just the psychology of a lifter feeling like they're moving forward towards the ultimate goal, the ultimate target. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to view it. But ultimately, yeah, I think kind of distilling your answers, Joe, from the kind of the main levers that we're looking to pull from your experience are kind of these pacing, the meeting the fatigue kind of timeline or the fatigue progression throughout a block for a given individual, and trying to map the pacing strategy or the desired kind of outline progression for a block to kind of overlap in a favorable way with those kind of fatigue strategies. So I think we can probably show a couple of those just as an example in the app. So Josh, if you want to head into day one and just kind of look at the difference between maybe one of these actually hit an X, Josh. I lied. You want to go back to the main screen and then hit, yep, exactly. Yep. And then go into more detail once you have a chance. Hit the gear. Yeah, just go to the first comp bench slot here. And so Joe was kind enough to send over his program, and we did a little bit of a deep dive into the X's and O's of it. There's definitely a couple of assumptions here made and a little bit of workarounds. I'd say we were able to recreate the intention, what I perceive to be somewhere in the 90 to 95% ballpark. So Joe, if there's anything that sticks out, that's not exactly what you do. There's probably a little bit of assumptions being made there. But Josh, if you want to go to protocols, so like this is just a basic example, I think, of kind of what Joe is getting at. So if you want to drop down the working set progression schemes there. So this is kind of just like a general kind of difference to kind of what Joe's getting at is, again, these RPs may be slightly off from what you actually do, but for the most part, on these kind of indicator sets or the competition exercises, maybe we'll have a little bit more of an aggressive progression scheme where it's relatively linear week to week, where we're looking for some sort of consistent jumps, trying to aim for some sort of load that we're aiming for at the end of the block. But if you were to compare that, Josh, compared to like his dumbbell pressing, which I think is like a couple exercises down there, that might have a slightly different progression scheme where we're essentially meeting that perceived RAR to kind of be the progression scheme is, like you said, Joe, kind of 1 week offset, where if you imagine that fourth week coming to the start of the block, it's essentially the same thing. You're still kind of progressing pseudo linearly, but now we've just offset things by a week so that the accessories that are being trained on the week that you're hitting your heaviest lift on those main movements are kind of allowing you to have a little bit of extra space, maybe a couple extra warm-ups, maybe a little extra fatigue from the heavier loads. It all kind of fits nicely together and allows you to kind of keep taking steps in the right direction. But the thing that's interesting is I'm sure, let's just paint like a theoretical scenario where maybe someone is maybe a little bit under muscled and we perceive that to be the case. That might be a case where we want to keep, and they're not talking about being fatigued throughout the block, and that doesn't really seem to inhibit their performance. Maybe that's a case, Josh, where you might want to change the progression scheme of the RPE to be actually pretty consistent and relatively flat, and staying at maybe a higher RPE throughout the entire block. Something like that. And so these are the types of things that I'm sure, Joe, when you're thinking about, working through your own training or the training of an athlete, these are the types of things that coaches are ultimately doing to kind of meet the needs of a given situation. We're taking all these external variables, we're taking the preferences of the athlete, their goals, these kind of things, and trying to kind of put all these things together to meet the situation that we're kind of looking at, and then using some of those higher level indicators like the exercises that we're really trying to see strength come up on to evaluate the effectiveness of what we're doing, and then kind of refine and tweak and kind of that general pattern there. So I don't know if you guys have any other examples that kind of come to mind to handle this kind of stuff, but to me that's a really cool thing that I think has been one of our goals, is to kind of meet that kind of coaching framework. And I think that's one of we've done a few times where we've got some feedback from coaches. And that was, I think, one of the coolest things that we heard back is like the way that the app is designed, or the way the software operates, is very much in line with kind of how a coach operates, or how a coach would think about it. And obviously our goal isn't necessarily to make it so you have to have a coach's level of understanding to leverage the utility of the app. We think we can help lifters across the spectrum. But I think, kind of like we said at the beginning of the podcast, starting from that upper level and trying to meet the needs of higher level athletes, I think benefits basically everyone across the spectrum as those kind of things kind of trickle down. But I've been talking for a while, so what do you guys have to say?
I just wanted to point out that when we first started Evolve, it was very, very it was the structure, right? We talk about Genesis and the engine. There wasn't a lot of flexibility there, and that might be great for a newer lifter who they just want to have a program to follow. But what's really cool with Genesis specifically is that we've, as you can see in this recording, that there's a lot of changes that we can make. So in this case, Zac created basically Joe's program from the spreadsheet and integrated it into the Genesis engine, which I think is actually just super cool, just as far as like the flexibility of the app that just was not a thing before.
Yeah, and to my knowledge, this isn't really a thing anywhere else, at the risk of shooting our own horn. But again, kind of coming at this from the perspective of, hey, powerlifting training or strength, you could even generalize this to strength training in general. So I would define that as like any athlete that has some sort of maximal strength goal, right? So for powerlifters, obviously that's a 1 rep max in squat, bench, deadlift, but this also applies, and the flexibility we have built into the engine also applies if you happen to really like training for 5RM on OHP and bench press for whatever reason, right? And again, if we have that structure that any strength athlete has, whether they know it or not, there's customization at all levels of the structure. So again, we have the training split, and a lot of powerlifting coaches and even athletes will use spreadsheets, and that's for good reason, right? You literally have a blank spreadsheet with empty cells, and you can fill in every level of detail that you want. And Joe, I from looking at your programming, you take full advantage of that, as do a lot of powerlifting coaches, especially those working with high level athletes. So to be able to recreate someone's program as high level as you is a really good test for us, and we feel we were able to achieve it and learn from it to improve future iterations of the product. But just to kind of show you, the listener at least, kind of what we mean by these different levels of structure is, we think a big piece of individualization is the frequency of SBD, which I think is pretty intuitive, right? So when you're creating a training split or a training week, some folks will be able to handle quite a bit more in terms of frequency. Some people will be able to handle quite a bit less, and that's okay. For example, heavier lifters probably aren't going to be benching 5 times per week, probably aren't going to be squatting 3 times per week. And again, that's all baked into the app. But of course, there's exceptions to that. So it's not a hard rule. And then that can be completely adjusted in whatever way you want by adjusting this training structure, dragging things around, right? Whatever slots you want can be moved wherever you want based on your preferences and whatever level of individualization that you want. And then again, you have the structure created, or you have that training split created, and then you can completely customize the training protocols and the progressions of those protocols in whatever way you want. So Joe's training is, again, a great test for that. So to kind of bring it back to you, Joe, if we look at this training week, like what is something that you kind of took a while for your training to like land on? Is there anything in terms of like the training split or the exact exercise selection that you're like, this is something I know my bench press needs, or I know my deadlift needs, or I know my squat needs? Because those can be helpful examples, I think, for the listener.
Yeah, so I'll go with bench press real quick.
Okay.
And this is probably an error from the human brain side of me, thinking the grass is greener on the other side, where I thought if I stripped away the specificity, volume, and intensity, and just ramp up accessories, I'll be able to at least somewhat maintain performance on bench. And I did this directly after I came back from my honeymoon, the 12-day layoff. And that layoff definitely affected my my top end, and I was a little bit detrained. But even after like 2-3 blocks in, I was like, okay, well, my bench still hasn't returned. And I was running more variation work, lower volume, more accessories. And there's always a time for that, right? But at a certain level, you just need a baseline workload just to maintain strength. And previously, when I was a sub 200 kilo bencher, I can get away with it. I was able to maintain my top end within like a couple percent, 1 or 2%. And I would just hammer accessories, get more jack, put more muscle on my frame. But the more experienced you become, the more you understand, like, okay, I need these certain staples in my program and I cannot remove them. Unless like, you have a totally different goal at hand. But if your goal is hitting the highest bench press possible, you need to have certain, like I said, staples within the program. And that's what I noticed. And I'm sure like if I had an auto-regulated AI machine backing it up, looking at the past data, they're like, okay, why would you like strip away everything that was working to route in this different direction? And it just didn't work at all. It took me actually it's my end of my 3rd block, and I'm finally resurrecting the bench press because I reintroduced way more specificity. So no more like super close grip benches, no more high volume work. All my sets are below like 4 reps right now, and this is how I responded best in the past. I was doing 19 to 21 sets a week. I'm at 20 right now, a lot higher intensities throughout all the days, and my bench finally is feeling near top end strengths. Whereas before it's just this lack of specificity, intensity, workload, all that was just so far down the drain. And I thought it would be a good experiment to run. Clearly, it was not. I'm not sure if I packed on any new tissue from the accessories either.
That was going to be my my question, Joe. Just out of curiosity, because yeah, when we were kind of putting your bench programming together, it was pretty interesting. Like you said, a lot of low rep sets, a lot of the specific variations kind of paired with the like low limiting variations like tempo, things like that, all in kind of the same session. So I thought some of those things were interesting. But I guess my question off of that, just out of curiosity, is do you think that the harvest, so to speak, from the additional accessory work wasn't as fruitful as you may have thought? Or do you essentially I'm asking, did the training go as intended and didn't work? Or did you basically not get the intended effect from the additional accessory work? Was it a very strong diminishing returns there? What have you? I'm just kind of curious, like coming off that layoff, maybe you weren't able to get kind of the additional mass built that you may have suspected. And maybe that's part of the reason the return didn't end up working out. I'm just kind of curious your perception there.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't, well, visually, at least in the mirror, I didn't notice any added mass on the chest. I feel like I already have a
There you
very
go.
big chest.
Citation.
Yeah, I feel like I have a very big chest as is, and maybe I need the intensity because you can still build muscle in all rep schemes. And if I push the intensity high enough, even on sets of 4 or 3, my chest is getting stimulated quite a lot. It's very fatiguing, but like I said, my bottleneck, at least for me on bench press, is not mass. It's simply, I think, workload and frequency. And this is basically the, I don't want to run into this now, but it's like a last ditch effort before I increase to 5 times a week. So I am increasing specificity and workload intensity all throughout the days, and it's working. And I may continue to push into this direction. Maybe I'll cap at like 6 sets a day, but after that, I have to increase frequency. But I don't want to make that change just yet because I knew this strategy worked in the past. So I'm gonna bring it back, push further into that direction to the point where it's just too much on each day, and then I'll increase the frequency. But that's where I think a slight overseeing can help understand, like, okay, well, you did all these previous strategies. They did work in the past. They're not showing good fruit in the current situation you're in. So maybe you make that slight adjustment. But those slight adjustments, those micro adjustments, those little levers that you're pulling are very, very nuanced, highly specific to the person. But I think the app can get like 99% of that down for the average lifter, intermediate, going into advanced as well. And then that slight overseeing can help further push you into that direction and literally master the app itself to understand like what works, what doesn't. And then once the app has that data, you're smooth sailing right after that again. But yeah, that's my take on it, at least.
Joe. So this is cool to like think through your training. It's funny you highlighted like how specific your bench press training is right now, and how moving away from that didn't seem to be fruitful. Of course, we could go back and forth about like how to actually
second order effects.
Yeah, second order effects, and like or like some listeners might have heard of the term like phase potentiation, or like, you know, potentially trying to create like an overreaching effect. But I generally align with you. It's like, man, I kind of just want to set training up such that if it was productive, I can detect that relatively quickly, and then I can be very efficient with getting back to what I know works if that slight deviation wasn't as fruitful as I thought it was going to be. But anyway, we could definitely go back and forth on that for a while. It's interesting you highlight the specificity though, because you also have a good amount of just general like bodybuilding type training, accessory type training. So you were doing a lot, it seems like, for a while.
I was doing more than what the program showed. I had a lot more.
Oh, you had even more.
When you say 19 to 21 sets, Joe, is that just benching?
Yeah, that's flat barbell benching only, not including, you know, flat dumbbell press, incline, all that. Just straight up bench press with the bar.
Yeah. So this is like, I think, a good example of like how someone like Joe, and Joe, obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm kind of using what you've mentioned up to this point. You need to be very smart with your pacing here of like this comp bench slot. And then maybe for a beginner, for something like dumbbell bench, you could start them at like an RP 9 to 10 and just keep them there, because they're just going to be fine. And I think what we see in the research and just practical experience as well is that a good default is training really, really hard as much as you can. But you just kind of pull that back as needed. For someone as strong as you are going to have to be quite intentional about pulling back some of those RPs in week 4, or not training at an RP 9 to 10 on all of your accessories all the time. And again, those are things that really, really do matter, especially as advancement increases and you're trying to be as precise as you are. And you mentioned that, hey, maybe if there was like some AI system in the background picking up on things as you go, that it would have pulled you a while ago to like quit going in the non-specific bench direction. And I'm with you. I think that's kind of like the pipe dream, right? Like someday we have something taking in all information regarding training and non-training stressors and various recovery metrics and training data, and the uncertainty around that training data and your all-time best, et cetera, and it'll spit out the perfect program. I'm quite skeptical of that happening anytime soon. And there's a reason why when Zac and I joined what was Evolve AI, we rebranded to just Evolve, because we really see the value in some of these smaller programming things that I think would be effectively impossible for a computer to pick up on or for an AI to pick up on. I don't think an AI is going to necessarily tell you that, hey, deloading your accessories in week 4 to set things up for a really productive primary bench slot in week 4 is going to be a game changer for you, because there's a lot of roads to Rome. There's a lot of ways to achieve that. And it just gets really messy really quickly. Instead, we want to create the tools and the structure for folks to have really good programming and leverage some of these tools that leverage some of these troubleshooting strategies that someone as high level as you, for both a coach and an athlete, takes advantage of, and have that at. So all of that is to say is this is a tool, and a tool that's going to expedite a lot of things, I think, for a lot of folks. And maybe in a second, I'll log into another Evolve Lifters account that's like kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum as you, right? You at the very highest level of advancement in the sport, whereas this other guy I'm thinking of is training for his first powerlifting meet. He just hit his first 3-plate deadlift, right? That's a totally different situation than you, but the tool can still serve that person, just as well as they can serve you, if you will. So anyway, as a tool, I think, with a spreadsheet, you can literally have infinite flexibility. You can fill in every single cell with the exact precision you want, whereas we want to kind of expedite that, make those things nice and accessible for everyone. And something that a spreadsheet can't do, though, is help you with within session stuff. And I'm curious about that, Joe. So like, if you think about your own training or lifters that you coach, how often are you making adjustments on the fly? Whether that is like exercise selection, the protocols themselves. So like changing the rep range, purposely overshooting or undershooting what the plan is, or are you basically just like, hey, this is the program, I'm going to execute it the best I can no matter what? I'm curious your general take on just like that more heavy-handed auto-regulation, if you will, within a session.
Yeah, so it's all lifter dependent, of course, but I don't tend to make too many changes on a program unless it's absolutely necessary. And if it's a brand new athlete as well, and they're more experienced and they know what exactly works and what doesn't sometimes, and let's say I steer away from those strategies that they were using in the past, and it didn't work, and it's going like week 1 to 2, and let's say I'm bench press, the bar feels still too heavy in the hand in comparison to when they had 2 priming singles the session prior, I may go back and reintroduce that on the fly. But if I know the athlete and they're just complaining that they're beat up, and I just know they do this every week 1 and week 2, and those points I'll keep it the same, because I know by week 4 the performance is going to show up. But if it's a brand new athlete, and like I said, if they're experienced enough, if they're a coach themselves, which I do have athletes that are also coaches, and I tell them beforehand, I'm like, okay, I'm going to experiment with this route at first. I'm going to put my twist to your programming, my own personal flavor to it, and if it doesn't work, we'll revert back to some of your old ways, and that's fine by me. I'm always down to reintroduce the old strategies that were working. But in those cases, I will change on the fly. So it's not too often. I'll be like, if I make a block, let's say I have 30 athletes right now, maybe 3 of them I'll go inside and adjust some variables or major variables, like adding a set or 2 sets, maybe taking away a primer set even. I may adjust accessories, though. Accessories are the biggest ones I adjust on the fly, depending on like if they a lot of lifters, they switch gyms periodically, right? Yeah. So that's something I'll change. Even like a high bar squat I may introduce instead of a low bar because elbows get too beat up. So these are little nuances that the athlete needs to know prior. Let's say they're not we're not communicating at the time of their session and their elbows are too beat up. They're like, I can't squat anymore. Well, I'll tell them beforehand. I'm like, if that happens, just go to high bar, go to SSB for your back down work. That's fine by me. So yeah, it's not too often I make changes, but it is something I will utilize. I'm not super rigid in my ways.
Yeah, I think that's pretty similar to the way that I approach it as well. Is like, for the most part, especially once you know someone, you can predict things pretty well. Of course, things come up, life happens. You do have to adjust things on the fly. I'm also curious about like within session stuff. So like, let's say you do map out a progression, and trying to think of an example. Maybe someone's just like really grooving, or you're just really grooving in a session, and you kind of just like feel like you could benefit from a little bit more accessory work. Would you ever go above what you have programmed, or are you just always stopping where you're at in terms of like the number of sets?
If I'm following the same pacing I was previously, and I know week 4 show up strong, I'll keep it the same regardless of how I feel on the day. But not all the time. Sometimes my human side gets a hold of the program too much. Like last week, for example, I had a 195 single on bench, fatigue single, and I didn't like the way it moved, so I had to like prove myself that I could do 200 easier. So I loaded 200, and it moved easier. I posted it; it looked a lot better. But that was the human side of me talking rather than the coach side. So that's something that I wouldn't recommend athletes do.
Yeah,
but there's sometimes
I do.
Yeah, the ego has to peek through every once in a while. Just so you're down for the grit.
If it moves better, you can never be upset at an athlete. But if they repeat it, or they take another jump that they shouldn't have, and it moves worse, then that's on them. So as a coach, you want all the praise, none of the blame. But another thing I found really helpful, that again I think software can deliver better than something like spreadsheets, is better adherence in terms of tracking. That's something I've already found really, really valuable, because, powerlifters, they like to think of those primary SBDs, especially week 4, what they're working up to. That's awesome. That's for good reason. At the same time, we kind of always want that stimulus in the background for their development, because those top sets on SBD, super important, but arguably just as important, if not more important, depending on the lifter, for long-term development, is their focus and intent for all the accessories after tempo bench that you see on the screen, right? Those are very, very important. And I don't know about you, but sometimes it can be hard to get athletes to log those things, let alone train those with a high degree of intent. So something we have baked into the app is basically a way to see previous performances from last week, so you can kind of have that progressive mindset. That progressive mindset comes really easy to powerlifters on the main lifts, especially if they have their progressions mapped out. But if you're just hanging out at like, RP 7 to 9 on whatever dumbbell bench, it's easy to just kind of coast, right? Or not bring the same focus to that. But I've found that when you actually have that data like in a nice visual view, it can really help the productiveness of not only logging of the training, but actually bringing a lot of focus to it. So I'm curious if you have any, if any of you guys have any frustrations with folks logging versus not logging.
The thing that comes to mind for me that we've already talked about a couple times too is like, we all like to think about the programming and the training and kind of the example of when things are going well and things are predictable. But when things aren't going well and you do inevitably hit a plateau, or you're trying to solve a problem, that's when the data or the logging becomes really, really important. So it really doesn't burn you until later down the line. So it's kind of easy to say, it's, they didn't log their dumbbell bench, but things are going well right now. The week 4s are going awesome. Things are trending up. It's not a big deal. But when you return to, a couple blocks later and things start to slow down, having that consistent logging and information to return to, whether that be looking at how many sets they did, the average RPE, whatever it ends up being, that information becomes golden and extremely valuable. So you can actually contextualize all the information, like you were saying, Joe, and having some sort of system and some sort of analytics that can help you make those decisions a little bit easier. So I just think encouraging logging in any way possible, and encouraging that consistency aspect of things, not only has benefits from the decision-making side of things when you inevitably hit plateaus, like I just said, but then Josh, like you said, I think having an interface that encourages high execution of training is something that goes very, very, underrated, I think, particularly in a sport that, obviously focuses on 3 lifts. But as you've mentioned multiple times, Joe, particularly for, younger lifters and lifters who haven't maximized their frame, having very, very high quality execution and effort and accessory work is going to be absolutely vital for maximizing your development in the long term. So any sort of system, whether that be, having a load to hit, whether it have reps to hit that you can try to beat every single session right in front of you when you're executing a session, I think is just absolutely paramount. And it seems like such a simple thing, but I think those kind of things and making those more accessible to as many lifters as possible is just you execute your accessory training with a higher degree of effort and intent and focus for, year upon year. That's going to have tons and tons of downstream consequences in a positive direction for maximizing your total across the sport. So
yeah, it's definitely my biggest, or one of my biggest obstacles with coaching. I've done a lot of different things to try to get my athletes to input the accessories. I've done like top sets, like RP base, and I'll do like a percent back down just so they can fill it out. Because if I just do the stagnant, 3x8 to 10, they just never do it. So I have to do like the 1x8 and then like 2x10 or like 90% after. They'll see the RPE, they'll treat it like the SBD movement.
And subconsciously that's telling you something, right? Yeah, and subconsciously that's telling you it's just like obviously the degree of priority isn't the exact same, but
yeah,
it's very, very important, and it's just like people don't treat it that way. So if there's anything we can do externally to improve that degree of effort, focus, and intent, it's just crucial.
So this is still in beta, and again, this is a beginner powerlifter that's using the app. And when I'm using the app, I use this all the time, where we have this easy history button for that exercise, and you can see in list view all of the sets you've done recently. They're dated with the weight, reps, and RPE that you used, and you can filter that by the set type. So in this case, they're not doing top sets with Romanian deadlift. Of course, that could be programmed if you want to do something like Joe and Zac just mentioned. But he's only had work sets, so that's why there's nothing for top sets. And then something that's really, really clutch, and I think a lot of coaches we've talked to about this really like, is the estimated maxes are basically broken up by set type. So any powerlifters listening might think about the focus and intent they bring to their top sets. And then on the work sets or their back off sets, they log something as an RP7, but was it really an RP7, right? They probably didn't have the same amount of hype or arousal going into that set. We could argue whether that's a good or a bad thing, but the point is that just like how you might not want to compare a week 4 to a week 1 in terms of performance, you might not want to compare a top set to a work set in terms of performance, because the conditions are just a bit different. So in the case of Romanian deadlift, again, we can look at that work set estimated max over the recent time period. And then if you look at like a main lift, where there have been top sets for at least a few weeks in this case, we can see that estimated max is a different number for the top set versus the work sets, right? And if you were to conflate the two, that would cause some issues in terms of like the recommended loads that the app gives based on the math it does in the background, for any progressions you have in mind for that slot, etc. So, we talked about very granular things today in terms of like deloading accessories, or just at least pulling back the RP of accessories in a week 4, the exact pacing of specific slots. Are we kind of biasing specificity versus a little bit less specific work, like Joe's example with bench press? Those are very important things, but probably on the more granular side. But what all lifters need is a progressive mindset, training with focus, training with intent. And an app or a software is never going to do that for you, but it can help. And that's the way that I think about it, is kind of, you can, I guess, bring the horse to water. You're never going to have them drink. But if you can have good structure, have the tools that elite lifters and elite coaches like Joe have landed on at your fingertips, and data that helps you make better decisions, it can be a huge net positive for everyone. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, but this was a cool exercise, I think, for everyone. Joe, I'm excited to see how things go with the rest of prep. So definitely keep us in the loop there. So I don't know, anyone have anything else to add? Or Joe, you have anything exciting with P4P coming up, or anything exciting in the personal life now that you're past the honeymoon? I think you said you're past the honeymoon now.
Yeah, that was after world. Well, I got eloped, and then I had my honeymoon, and then I'm having the wedding party. So it's like the totally different order going on right now.
How long was the honeymoon?
Backloading.
The honeymoon, how long ago, or how long was it in duration?
How long was it?
Oh, I think 8 days. 8 days long.
8 days. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
What's
Were you like completely unplugged?
Yeah, I didn't train or nothing. I just chilled at I didn't even chill. I was doing some vigorous hiking on the mountains on Madeira, Portugal, and going to the beaches and stuff. Yeah.
Nice. I'm planning our honeymoon for next year right now, and I think I'm going to purposefully not buy like the international data plans, because I want to be completely off the grid. So
no, I had to. I still had to work, so I can't take more than 3 days off without responding. It can't happen. It's just my mental won't. I would just sit there in the back of my brain saying like, oh, I got 30 people to respond to. I know they got some important sessions. So that's like the biggest mental stress that I have going on the daily.
yeah, I feel you there. That's something that like I go back and forth on, because I know early on with coaching, I was right there with you, like waking up early on vacation, like got to get everything taken care of. I think there's a middle ground, and the biggest thing I've been surprised about is how supportive people are.
Yeah.
Either way, so there's a middle ground there. Obviously, if someone's competing or they have a really big session, it's like, all right, kind of gotta do it. So maybe I will have to get the data plan ultimately. But yeah, anyone else have everything, or is this a good place to wrap up?
I think it's a good place, Joe. Thanks as always for, not only giving us your brain, but also giving us an opportunity to test out kind of a really good case from a high level lifter and coach to kind of test out what Evolve is able to do. So we really appreciate that, and obviously your time.
I appreciate all y'all for having me on.
Sweet.
All right.
Kristen, you'll do the magic in wrapping us up.
All right. Well, thank you guys for this chat. This is actually really interesting for me. I kind of just listened in the background, but I do appreciate it. And Joe, next time you're here in this area, definitely let us know. You have to come by the lab.
I will, for sure.
Well,